The billionaire's blind date thought he was too ordinary, too boring, and left. At the next table, a poor girl sat alone, clutching a purse with only $5 inside, waiting for someone who would never come. The restaurant hummed with low conversations and the faint strains of a jazz quartet that played near the bar. Candlelight glowed on polished silverware and glasses of wine. Couples leaned close to one another in soft intimacy, while servers moved with practiced grace. To the casual eye, it was a perfect night in a perfect place. Yet at two different tables in opposite corners, two stories of rejection unfolded at the same time. Daniel Blake had chosen to come here under a veil of anonymity. To the world, he was a billionaire, a man whose name appeared in business magazines and financial reports. But tonight he had worn a simple navy jacket and an understated watch. No limousine dropped him off at the entrance. No photographers followed him through the door. He had wanted to know what it felt like to sit across from someone who did not know his wealth or his status. He wanted to be seen as a man, not a symbol. At first, the date had seemed promising. The woman who arrived was elegant, her perfume strong enough to linger in the air after she sat down. She asked a few polite questions about his work and his background. Daniel answered honestly, but left out the empire he had built, the properties he owned, and the company that bore his family name. He spoke instead about liking to cook his own breakfast and enjoying long walks with his daughter Sophie. The woman's smile grew thin. Within half an hour, she glanced at her phone twice, then excused herself to take a call. She never returned. Daniel sat in silence, his untouched glass of scotch, catching the light from the candles. Around him, the restaurant moved on, without noticing that he was now alone. He felt a sting of disappointment, though not surprise. He had chosen to present himself as an ordinary man, and had been discarded as ordinary. That was the experiment, and this was the result. Still in the quiet of his thoughts, he felt the old ache of being unwanted. Across the room, another drama played out. Emily Carter walked in 15 minutes early, wearing the only dress she owned that looked presentable. It had once belonged to her mother, a pearl-colored fabric, now frayed slightly at the hem. She had brushed her blonde hair carefully and applied a touch of makeup bought from a discount store. She told herself tonight might be different, that someone out there might see her for who she was. The hostess had led her to a small table by the window where the glow from the city lights pressed gently against the glass. Emily checked her phone twice, then folded her hands together on the table. At 6:45, she was hopeful. At 7, she was anxious. At 7:15, she texted the man who had asked her out through a dating app. No answer. At 7:30, she called. The line rang once, then went to voicemail. A few minutes later, a message came through. It was cruel in its brevity. "You actually showed up. Not my type, do not wait." Her cheeks flushed hot, then cold. She set the phone face down and pressed her lips together until the trembling stopped. She had promised herself not to cry in public. The restaurant continued to sparkle around her. Waiters delivered plates of pasta and steak. Laughter rose and fell like the tide. Emily lifted her glass of water and sipped slowly to keep herself grounded. Inside her purse, folded neatly, was a single $5 bill. It was meant to be emergency money, not to buy dinner. She had come with the simple hope that the man would appear, that he would share a meal with her. Now that hope dissolved in the space of a text message. Two lives that had never touched now mirrored one another in rejection. Daniel looked up from his silent table and noticed the girl by the window. He saw her stiff shoulders, her forced composure, and the way she clutched her phone as though it might still deliver a different ending. He did not hear her words, but he recognized the posture. He knew that battle of pride against pain. For a moment, he let his gaze linger. She could not have been more different from the women who usually filled his world of galas and boardrooms. There was no diamond on her wrist, no designer label on her dress. Yet there was something in the way. She sat straight, refusing to collapse, under humiliation that struck a chord deep within him. He lifted his glass slowly and took a measured sip, still watching without meaning to. Emily shifted slightly, sensing eyes upon her, though she did not look his way. She straightened her spine, drew a breath, and blinked fast. Daniel turned his face back toward his table, his expression unreadable. But in the quiet space between them, something had begun. Neither of them knew it yet. The restaurant was a place designed to make people forget the outside world. Soft golden light fell from chandeliers that hung like clusters of stars above the tables. The walls were painted in warm tones of deep maroon and forest green, and the booths were upholstered in velvet that swallowed sound and gave every conversation the illusion of privacy. A jazz quartet played in the corner, their instruments weaving a background tapestry of saxophone, piano, bass, and drums. The rhythm was slow and sultry, perfectly matched to the clinking of glasses and the murmur of laughter. On most nights, this place belonged to couples celebrating anniversaries, business people closing deals, or friends enjoying a rare night out. Tonight, it also belonged to two strangers living out different kinds of disappointment. Daniel Blake blended in better than he expected. His decision to hide his true identity was not an accident. He had long grown tired of women seeing only the billionaire title and not the man behind it. He had arrived in a simple navy jacket, pressed but not flashy, a crisp white shirt, and dark slacks that looked elegant yet unremarkable. His watch was quality but understated, and he carried himself with a quiet confidence, rather than the magnetic presence that usually announced his status. The maitre d' had greeted him politely without recognition and seated him in a discreet corner. That was exactly what Daniel wanted. He wanted to feel normal for once, even if normal meant being dismissed. His blind date had come with expectations painted across her smile. She had looked at the room and then at him, and her expression shifted almost immediately. Daniel had answered her questions with honesty, though carefully edited. He spoke of being a single father, of his love for cooking and reading, of how his free time was mostly spent outdoors with his daughter Sophie. He did not speak of the empire that stretched across states or the headquarters tower that bore his family name. To him, the omission felt like truth. To her, it must have felt like poverty of status. The longer she sat, the more restless she became, until at last she excused herself with her phone pressed to her ear. He had known even before she rose from the table that she was not coming back. So Daniel sat alone. He watched the amber liquid in his glass catch the light, and he thought of Sophie at home with the nanny probably asleep by now, curled in her small bed, clutching the stuffed rabbit he had bought her. The disappointment of the evening was sharp, but it was not unfamiliar. He had felt this sting before, the sting of being enough, and yet somehow not enough. On the other side of the room, Emily Carter tried to keep her hope alive. Her table was near the window where the glow of the city bled through glass panes and mixed with candlelight. She was young, only 22, and still carried the freshness of someone not yet crushed by life, though the shadows of hardship already clung to her. Her dress was the most treasured thing in her small closet, a pearl-colored garment once worn by her mother. She had stitched the loose threads herself and pressed it carefully that afternoon in her tiny apartment. To anyone else, it was just a simple dress, a little outdated, a little frayed, but to Emily it was armor. She wore it with the memory of the woman who had always told her she was worth something. She arrived early, smoothing the fabric against her knees as she sat down. The hostess offered her a menu, but Emily only glanced at it. She knew her budget. In her purse folded between the lining was a single $5 bill. It was not enough for a meal here, not even for an appetizer. She had planned to rely on the generosity of the date. She was about to meet a man she had matched with on a dating app. His messages had seemed thoughtful and gentle. She had taken weeks to agree to meet him, telling herself to be careful. Tonight she hoped maybe, just maybe, he would prove different from the others. At first, waiting was easy. The room was warm and filled with life. But as the minutes ticked past, she began to fidget with her phone. At 6:45, she felt fine. At 7, she told herself he was just late. By 7:15, she typed a short message. "Hey, I am here, just checking in." At 7:30, she tried calling. The call went to voicemail. Then came the reply, "You actually showed up, not my type, do not wait." She read it once, then again, then a third time, until the letters blurred. The pain was not only in being rejected, but in the casual cruelty of the words. She pressed her lips together, refusing to let tears fall. Around her, couples clinked glasses of wine, laughing without a care. Emily lifted her water glass and sipped, holding the stem with steady fingers, though her hand trembled when she set it down. She thought about the $5 in her purse. It was her bus fare home, her safety net in case of emergencies. Tonight it represented how little she had to hold on to. She would not order food, she would not stay long. She would gather her pride around her like a shawl and leave as quietly as she had entered. Daniel noticed her before he realized he was watching. His eyes had wandered across the room, drawn not by beauty or glamour, but by the stillness of someone fighting not to collapse. She reminded him of nights long ago when he had felt invisible despite all the lights on him. He saw the way she glanced at the door every few minutes, the way her jaw tightened as if bracing against humiliation. Emily, on her side, felt the weight of someone's gaze, though she did not meet it. She pulled her purse closer to her lap, folded her hands around her phone, and forced her shoulders back. If she left in shame, she wanted at least to walk tall. The restaurant remained alive with laughter, music, and the warmth of others. But in two corners sat a billionaire pretending to be ordinary, and a girl who had never known what it felt like to be anything but ordinary. In their isolation, their stories had begun to rhyme. Neither of them knew the other's name, yet neither could have guessed that the night would be remembered not for rejection, but for the moment their paths crossed. Daniel shifted in his seat, his eyes lingering a second longer than they should. Emily adjusted her dress, smoothed the fabric, and drew a breath. The room around them spun in golden light, but for both of them, the evening had already turned into something else. Daniel sat motionless after the woman who was supposed to be his blind date vanished into the crowd with her phone pressed to her ear and a polite smile that had already faded. He did not chase after her. He did not ask the waiter to check outside. He simply sat back and watched the empty chair across from him. The untouched scotch glistened under the candlelight, as if mocking him with its golden clarity. In theory, he had prepared for this outcome, because he knew what it meant to hide his name and fortune. Yet when reality came, the sting was deeper than expected. He had wanted a genuine moment, and instead he was left with silence. He had wanted someone to look at him as a man, and not as a billionaire, but the absence of wealth had translated into absence of worth. Daniel ran a hand over his jaw, feeling the tension in his muscles. He was used to boardrooms where every word carried weight, and to social events where every smile hid an agenda. This was supposed to be different. Tonight was supposed to remind him that somewhere beyond the shadow of his company, he could still connect with another human being. Instead, all he found was the echo of rejection. He remembered his daughter Sophie waiting at home, her nanny tucking her in. She would ask him in the morning if his evening had gone well, and he would smile and change the subject. How could he explain to a child that sometimes people walked away because they did not see value in who you really were? Across the restaurant, Emily held her phone tightly in her hand, staring at the cruel message that had just arrived. The words burned on the screen. "You actually showed up. Not my type. Do not wait." She tried to swallow the lump rising in her throat. She had spent all afternoon preparing curling her hair with an old iron, applying the cheapest mascara she could afford, and smoothing her mother's dress over and over again until it lay just right. She had dared to hope, and now that hope had been crushed in less than a dozen words. Her stomach ached not only from hunger, but from humiliation. She placed the phone face down on the table as if hiding the message could erase it. The waiter approached with a gentle smile, asking if she would like to order. She shook her head quickly, forcing a smile and whispering that she was still waiting. The waiter hesitated, sensing the truth, but retreated politely. Emily glanced at her purse, knowing that inside lay the last $5 she had. It was not meant for dinner, it was meant for emergencies. She had convinced herself that tonight would not require backup, that her date would arrive and offer to pay, and that for once she could enjoy a meal without guilt. Now she wondered if she would even afford the bus fare home. Time passed slowly. Couples continued their conversations around her as if she did not exist. She tried to straighten her posture and hold her chin high, but her eyes blurred and she blinked rapidly to stop the tears. She would not cry in front of strangers. She would not allow herself that vulnerability. Daniel watched her from across the room. At first, he had only noticed the stiffness of her shoulders, but then he saw the tiny movements, the way her fingers tightened around the napkin, the way her lips pressed together until they paled. He knew that look. He had seen it in mirrors during his own younger days when the world seemed to pass him by. He lifted his scotch and took a slow sip, not because he wanted it, but because he needed a moment to steady himself. The memory of his wife flickered in his mind. She had once told him that loneliness was louder in crowded places. He felt the truth of that now. The quartet shifted to a livelier tune, and laughter rose around him, but Daniel felt none of it. His table was a bubble of silence, just like hers. Emily finally allowed herself to check the door one last time. Each time it opened, her heart leapt before falling again. Couples entered, friends laughed. Business partners shook hands, but not one of them was for her. She whispered under her breath, telling herself to leave with dignity. She gathered her purse and placed the strap over her shoulder. When she stood, her knees trembled, and she gripped the edge of the table for balance. At that exact moment, Daniel shifted too, leaning back in his chair and letting out a breath. Their eyes met briefly across the room, not long enough for a word to pass, but long enough for recognition to spark. Two people alone in a sea of companionship had seen each other. Emily turned away quickly, embarrassed at being caught in her vulnerability. She adjusted the strap of her purse and started toward the door. Daniel watched her pass by his table. He noticed the wear on her shoes, the careful way she avoided brushing against other chairs, and the determined lift of her chin. She walked like someone trying to hide the fracture lines within her. He looked down at his glass and then back at the empty chair across from him. The similarity between their situations was almost absurd. He the billionaire, hiding in plain sight, and she the poor girl clutching her last $5. Both had been rejected for reasons that had nothing to do with their hearts. Daniel thought about saying something, then stopped. He had no right to intrude on her pain, yet he could not ignore the flicker of recognition that had sparked when their eyes met. He knew what it felt like to be abandoned, to be judged, to be unseen. Emily stepped into the hallway outside the dining room, then paused. The city lights shone through the glass door ahead, and she could hear the faint sound of traffic. Her chest tightened and she bit her lip. Part of her wanted to vanish into the night. Part of her wanted anyone, to tell her that she mattered. Behind her, Daniel signaled for the check, though he had barely touched his food. The waiter approached quietly, and Daniel handed him a card without glancing. He leaned back in his chair, staring once more at the doorway where the girl had disappeared. The sound of glasses clinking and laughter rolled over him again, but the echo of silence remained louder. Emily stepped outside, breathing in the cool night air. She leaned against the wall for a moment, composing herself. She thought about calling a friend, but she had none nearby. She thought about walking to the bus stop, but the $5 in her purse felt like a fragile shield, and she dreaded spending it. She pushed away from the wall, determined not to let despair anchor her. Daniel remained inside, still staring at the door. His heart wrestled with a decision. He had been raised to maintain control, to keep his life compartmentalized, but something about the girl by the window would not leave his mind. He recognized her struggle because it mirrored his own, though from different sides of life. He set his glass down and ran a hand through his hair. For years he had lived behind a fortress of wealth and expectation, but tonight that fortress felt like a prison. Watching someone else suffer in silence had cracked the walls. Emily walked down the block slowly, her heels clicking on the pavement. She kept her gaze ahead, trying not to look back, yet she felt the weight of what had just happened pressing on her chest. She had been discarded without thought and left hungry in more ways than one. But somewhere behind her, a man who looked ordinary but carried more than she could know, sat in silence thinking of her. Neither of them realized it yet, but abandonment had bound them together. Emily reached the edge of the block and paused beneath the glow of a street lamp. The night air wrapped around her thin shoulders, and she hugged her purse tighter. Her stomach growled, but she ignored it. Pride was all she had left, and she was determined not to crumble. She turned back toward the restaurant entrance, debating whether to step inside just long enough to use the restroom and compose herself before walking to the bus stop. Her hand hovered near the door handle, then dropped. She could not face the tables full of laughter again. She took a slow breath and whispered to herself that it was time to go home. Inside, Daniel had risen from his seat. He told the waiter quietly to pack the uneaten meal and add another dish of pasta and lemonade. The waiter looked puzzled, but nodded. Daniel stepped into the hallway, adjusting his jacket. His plan had been to leave quietly, to vanish into the night, as he always did when evenings like this soured. Yet something tugged at him, an image of the girl by the window, clutching her purse. He found himself walking faster, as if propelled by something beyond reason. Emily pushed the door open just as Daniel stepped out. She nearly collided with him and stumbled. Her heel caught the edge of the rug, and she braced for a fall, but a steady hand reached out and caught her elbow. She looked up startled and met Daniel's eyes. For a moment neither spoke. The sounds of the city filled the silence horns in the distance, the rush of evening traffic, the hum of conversations from passers-by. Emily straightened quickly, murmuring a thank you, and tried to pull away. Daniel released her gently, but his gaze did not shift. He noticed the flush on her cheeks, the determination in her posture. He sensed her urge to escape, but he also sensed her exhaustion. Without planning, the words slipped out. "Seems like we are both dining alone tonight. Why not save one table?" He gestured back toward the entrance. Emily blinked, uncertain whether she had heard him correctly. Her first instinct was to decline. She could not accept pity, not from a stranger, not when she was already humiliated. She shook her head lightly and whispered that she was fine. Daniel tilted his head, studying her. There was no trace of arrogance in his eyes, only calm sincerity. He held the takeout bag in one hand and his untouched scotch in the other. His tone was soft but steady. "I am not offering charity. I am suggesting that no one should leave hungry while tables are full inside." Emily hesitated. Her pride battled her hunger. Her purse grew heavy in her lap, as if reminding her of the single bill folded within. She glanced at the restaurant door, then at him. He seemed ordinary in his simple jacket, but there was something about the way he spoke that carried quiet authority. Against her better judgment, she nodded once. "Only for a few minutes," she said, almost apologetically. Daniel's lips curved into the faintest smile. "A few minutes will do." He led her back inside, holding the door open with a small courtesy that felt almost old-fashioned. Emily walked in, aware of the stares from couples who noticed her return. She kept her chin high, pretending not to care. Daniel guided her to his corner table and gestured for her to sit. The waiter reappeared, almost on cue, setting down the fresh plate of pasta and a tall glass of sparkling lemonade. Emily froze. "I did not order this," she whispered. Daniel replied evenly, "It is taken care of. Consider it a reminder that you deserve to eat, even when the world tells you otherwise." Emily's throat tightened. She lowered her gaze to the plate steam rising from the sauce. For a long moment she did not move. Daniel sat across from her without touching his food, without pressing her. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the soft notes of the jazz band. Finally, Emily lifted her fork and twirled a small portion. She tasted it cautiously. Warmth spread across her tongue and down to her chest, and she realized how long it had been since she had eaten a real meal. She set the fork down quickly, embarrassed by the rush of emotion. Daniel leaned back, watching not with pity, but with curiosity. He broke the silence gently. "I was on a blind date too." She did not like what she saw. "I guess ordinary does not sell well these days." Emily glanced up, surprised. He looked too composed, too steady to be confessing rejection. She searched his face for mockery but found none. Instead, there was only honesty. Her lips parted, then closed again. She managed a small nod. "Mine never came at all," she whispered. His phone buzzed once, and then he sent that message. She stopped herself before her voice cracked. Daniel's eyes softened. He did not ask for details. He did not need to. The weight of disappointment hung clearly between them like smoke. He lifted his glass and took a sip, then set it down carefully. "It seems we both lost something tonight," he said, "but maybe we also found something neither of us expected." Emily frowned, uncertain. "What is that?" she asked. Daniel met her gaze steadily. "Company." Her cheeks warmed, and she quickly looked back at her plate. The word felt heavier than it should have. She picked up her fork again, partly to hide her fluster, and partly because hunger overpowered hesitation. Bite after bite, she felt her strength return. Daniel sat quietly, letting her eat before speaking again. The minutes passed slowly yet easily. For the first time that evening, Emily felt the knot in her chest loosen. Across the table, Daniel felt the same. Two abandoned hearts had found an unlikely intersection, and though neither admitted it aloud, they both understood that the night had shifted. The story that began with rejection was not finished. Emily sat with her fork poised above the plate, unsure if she should keep eating in front of a stranger. Yet the food was warm, and her body betrayed her pride with each pang of hunger. She twirled another bite of pasta and took it slowly, savoring the flavors that felt like luxury compared to the instant noodles she usually ate at home. Daniel watched her without judgment, his expression calm, almost unreadable. He leaned back in his chair, one hand resting on the table, and the other loosely holding the rim of his glass. At last he spoke, his tone casual, but carrying a weight she did not expect. "You thought you were meeting someone who would see you tonight. I thought I was meeting someone who would believe me when I said I liked cooking breakfast more than private jets. Turns out both of us were wrong." Emily's brows drew together. She looked at him carefully, trying to decide if he was mocking her, but his eyes remained steady, sincere. She placed her fork down. "So you really were on a blind date?" she asked softly. Daniel nodded. She did not like what she saw. "I think she wanted someone with flash. I gave her ordinary." He offered a small shrug. "I suppose I failed the test." Emily let out a breath that was almost a laugh, but more like disbelief. "Ordinary," she repeated. "You do not seem ordinary, not the way you carry yourself." He tilted his head, considering. "Appearances are deceptive. Ordinary to one person is extraordinary to another." He lifted his glass again, but only sipped water this time. "What about you?" Why agree to meet someone from an app? Emily's fingers tightened around her napkin. Because sometimes loneliness is heavier than fear. She looked down quickly, ashamed of her honesty. Daniel did not flinch. "Loneliness," he repeated quietly. "I know that weight well." Silence settled again, but this time it was not suffocating. Emily twirled more pasta and chewed thoughtfully. She dared to glance at him again. There was something unusual about the man across from her. He had the kind of presence that suggested authority, yet he sat with patience, letting her guide the pace. She wanted to ask about his life, but hesitated. What if he thought she was prying? What if he thought she was desperate to know more? Daniel sensed her restraint. He decided to bridge the gap with humor. "At least your date did not show up," he said lightly. Mine sat down, realized I was not what she wanted, and left with a smile that told me she would not even remember my name tomorrow. Emily looked up startled, then shook her head. "That is worse," she admitted, "to be measured and discarded right in front of you." She bit her lip, then whispered, "At least I had hope until the message came." Daniel gave a faint smile. We both had hope, and we both lost it. But perhaps that is what makes this moment possible. He gestured between them. Emily hesitated. She wanted to argue, but part of her knew he was right. Two separate disappointments had led them to the same table. She tried to shift the topic. "So you like cooking?" she asked. Daniel chuckled quietly. "Yes, Sophie loves pancakes with strawberries. I make them every weekend." He stopped himself, realizing he had mentioned his daughter. Emily's curiosity sparked. "Sophie?" she asked gently. "My daughter," he answered simply. "She is 5. Emily's eyes softened. "You are a father," she whispered. "Yes, and you?" he asked. "No children." She shook her head quickly. "I am still finishing school, nursing program, part-time jobs to pay rent." She trailed off, embarrassed to reveal so much. But Daniel did not react with judgment. Instead, he leaned slightly forward, his eyes attentive. "That sounds exhausting but meaningful. Nursing requires strength." Emily blinked, caught off guard by the respect in his tone. Most people dismissed her studies as unimportant or impractical. She lifted her chin a little higher. "It is hard, but I want to help people. My mother always said healing is more than medicine. Sometimes it is listening." Daniel's expression shifted just slightly, as if her words touched something within. He nodded slowly. She was right. Healing begins when someone feels seen. Emily felt a sudden lump in her throat. She had not expected such a response. She smiled faintly to mask the emotion rising inside her. "And you, what do you do?" she asked cautiously. Daniel paused, choosing his words carefully. He did not want to reveal his empire, not tonight. "I manage projects," he said vaguely. "It keeps me busy, but I prefer time at home with my daughter." Emily studied him. His answer was evasive, but not dishonest. She sensed layers he was not willing to reveal, and for some reason she respected that. They shared another quiet stretch where the music filled the gap. The jazz quartet shifted into a soft ballad, and the notes curled around their table like whispers. Emily finally broke the silence. "You know people will think this is strange. Two strangers sharing a meal after being rejected." Daniel smiled faintly. "Let them think what they want. They are not the ones sitting here." "You are." She exhaled a small laugh. "You talk like someone used to being listened to. And you," she asked, "what makes you so calm?" Daniel glanced at his glass, then back at her. "Because I have learned that the cruelest thing is not being left behind. It is being looked at and still unseen." Emily froze. The words pierced her like an arrow. She had always felt invisible. She blinked hard and looked away, but her chest tightened. Daniel watched her reaction quietly and knew he had touched something real. He let the silence linger to give her space. Emily whispered after a long pause, "That is exactly how I feel, like I am invisible until someone needs me for something." Then they forget me again. Daniel's voice lowered. You are not invisible tonight. The sincerity in his tone startled her. She met his gaze, and for the first time felt warmth, not pity, but recognition. The noise of the restaurant faded around them. It was just two people sharing wounds without shame. Minutes turned into nearly an hour. Emily ate slowly, finishing her plate. Daniel spoke of little things like favorite books and the way Sophie insisted on bedtime stories. Emily shared about long shifts at the library where she worked evenings and the way she sometimes studied under flickering fluorescent lights. The conversation was not grand, yet it felt profound. By the time Emily set down her fork, the weight on her shoulders had lessened. She realized she was smiling faintly. Daniel noticed. He leaned back and let out a breath as though content. For the first time all night, he did not feel abandoned. For the first time, Emily did not feel invisible. The meal had ended, but neither Daniel nor Emily seemed in a hurry to leave. The table between them still carried the faint aroma of pasta and lemon, but the true substance of the evening was no longer food. It was the quiet exchange of truths that hung in the air like fragile glass. Emily folded her hands in her lap, unsure if she should excuse herself, yet unwilling to break whatever fragile connection had formed. Daniel watched her with an expression that blended curiosity and restraint. He had spent years surrounded by people who spoke to him for what he could give, not for who he was. Yet here sat a young woman who had no idea of his fortune and still listened as though his words mattered. He found himself leaning into that space, craving more. Emily finally spoke, her voice soft. You mentioned your daughter earlier, Sophie, right? Daniel nodded. Yes, Sophie. She is 5 and she is the brightest part of my life. His eyes softened as he spoke. She has this way of laughing that makes even the worst day bearable. Emily smiled faintly. You must be a good father. Daniel tilted his head. I try. It is not easy balancing everything, but she deserves the best of me. Sometimes I fear I fail her. Sometimes I fear she will grow up remembering absence more than presence. Emily's chest tightened at the vulnerability in his voice. She thought of her own childhood, the absence of her mother who passed too soon, and the father who had drifted away before she was old enough to remember him. She leaned forward slightly. Children remember love more than schedules, she whispered. They carry the warmth of being wanted, even if life was imperfect. Daniel studied her face, and for a moment he felt the sting of emotion rise unbidden. How could someone so young speak words that reached directly into the quiet fears he carried? He cleared his throat and tried to steady his voice. And you, he asked, do you have family nearby? Emily shook her head. No, just me. My mother passed when I was in high school. Since then, I have worked jobs to keep myself afloat while finishing school. Nursing is my focus now. She paused, then added, I want to be someone who helps people who have no one else. Daniel leaned in, slightly compelled by the sincerity in her tone. That sounds like more than ambition. It sounds like calling. Emily blinked at him, her heart skipping unexpectedly at the respect in his words. Most people dismissed her choice as impractical or questioned how she would ever pay her bills. Yet he spoke as though her dream mattered. She nodded slowly. Maybe it is. My mother always said that the world needs people who can sit with pain without looking away. Daniel let the sentence linger. It resonated too deeply for him to dismiss. He thought of late nights sitting with Sophie when fevers rose. of boardrooms where people pretended weakness did not exist. Emily's words felt like a bridge to something he had long buried. He said quietly, "She was right. It takes courage to sit with pain." He realized then that he was revealing more than he had planned. Usually he guarded his inner life tightly, but something about Emily disarmed him. He wanted to tell her that he had known great losses, that his wife had been the one who once made loneliness bearable. But he held back for now. He did not want pity to enter the space between them. Emily sensed his restraint, but did not push. Instead, she shared more of her own struggle. "I juggle 2 part-time jobs," she said, "one at the library and one at a small cafe. Most nights I come home exhausted, but I keep going because I know my mother would want me to finish. Sometimes I wonder if hope is foolish." Daniel answered gently, "Hope is never foolish. It is the only reason we rise again after disappointment." He thought of how he had risen after building his company from scratch, after losing his partner after raising Sophie alone. He rarely admitted that hope was his anchor, but tonight he let the truth slip out. Emily held his gaze, her lips parting slightly. She felt as if he had spoken directly to the emptiness inside her and filled it with light. She whispered, "Do you always talk like this?" Daniel gave a soft smile. "Only when someone is truly listening." The air between them shifted once more, a subtle pull that neither acknowledged but both felt. Emily took a sip of her lemonade to steady herself. Daniel glanced at her empty plate, then at the purse she clutched, as though still protecting the $5 inside. He thought about revealing that he could pay for 1,000 meals like this without noticing the cost, but he knew that was not what she needed. She needed dignity, not charity. He decided instead to let the silence be a comfort. Emily looked around the room, then back at him. "It is strange," she said. "Tonight began with humiliation for both of us, but sitting here now it feels different." Daniel nodded slowly. Sometimes rejection clears the table so that the right person can sit down. Her cheeks warmed, and she looked away, but the corners of her lips lifted. She had not expected to laugh tonight, or to feel safe sharing pieces of herself. Yet here she was, opening up to a man she had just met. He leaned closer, his voice quieter. "Emily, I do not believe this meeting is an accident." She inhaled sharply, the sound of her name on his lips startling her. But she did not argue. Deep down, she felt it too. The night had conspired to place them at the same table. She whispered, "Neither do I." The moment stretched fragile and profound. 2 strangers sat together in a crowded restaurant, unseen by the world but seen by each other. For Daniel, it was the first time in years he had spoken with such vulnerability. For Emily, it was the first time in months she felt valued, not overlooked. They sat like that for a long while, exchanging stories that dug deeper with each passing minute. And though neither admitted it aloud, both knew the evening had transformed from mere coincidence into the beginning of something neither dared to hope for, but both desperately needed. The following weeks unfolded like a fragile rhythm. Daniel and Emily found excuses to see one another sometimes, at the same restaurant where their strange evening had begun, sometimes in quieter corners of the city where the weight of expectation did not reach them. Each meeting deepened the quiet bond they had formed, but along with it came an undercurrent of fear. Neither dared to call it love not yet, but both recognized that something was growing, something that could change the course of their lives. Emily poured herself into her studies with a renewed sense of purpose. She attended lectures during the day and worked her cafe shifts at night, but Daniel's words lingered whenever exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. "Hope is never foolish," he had said, and she repeated it silently like a prayer. Then came the letter. She found it in her mailbox one rainy morning, the envelope stamped with the emblem of the National Nursing Foundation. With trembling fingers, she opened it and read the words she had dreamed of for years. Full scholarship awarded to pursue a year-long specialization in pediatric care at a program out of state. Her heart soared, then crashed. It was everything she had worked for, everything her mother had urged her toward. Yet it also meant leaving behind the one person who had begun to make her feel less alone. That evening she sat across from Daniel at a small cafe. The smell of coffee and cinnamon rolls surrounded them, but her appetite was gone. She slid the letter across the table and whispered, "I got it." Daniel picked it up, reading carefully. His face softened with pride. "Emily, this is incredible. You deserve this." His voice was steady, but beneath it, his chest tightened. If she left, he would be alone again. Sophie had grown attached to her too quickly, asking about Emily when she was not around, and smiling in a way Daniel had not seen since his wife passed. He forced a smile anyway. "You have to go. This is your dream." Emily looked at him, her eyes wide. But what if leaving means losing this? She gestured softly between them. Daniel's throat ached. He wanted to tell her to stay, to admit that she had filled an emptiness he had not even realized was so vast. But the fear of selfishness stopped him. "You cannot build your life around me," he said gently. "You need to build it around your calling." Emily swallowed hard, fighting the tears that threatened. She had always believed love required sacrifice, but was sacrifice worth it if it meant silencing her purpose? The silence between them stretched heavy, and unspoken words filled the air. Days passed, and distance began to creep into their interactions. Emily avoided calling too often, afraid of making the goodbye harder. Daniel buried himself in work, taking meetings late into the night, convincing himself that distraction was strength. Sophie sensed the shift. One evening, as Daniel tucked her into bed, she asked Daddy, "Why does Emily not come over anymore?" Daniel froze. He brushed her hair back and whispered, "She is busy, sweetheart." But Sophie's small voice replied, "She makes you smile. She makes me smile too." Daniel kissed her forehead, unable to answer. Emily, meanwhile, prepared for the possibility of leaving. She researched the program in Oregon, the classes, the rotations, the housing. On paper, it was perfect. In her heart, it felt like tearing something fragile before it even had a chance to bloom. One afternoon, she sat in the library flipping through textbooks, but the words blurred. She thought of Daniel's steady gaze, the way he listened, the way he never looked at her, as though she were less. She closed the book and pressed her palms against her eyes. For the first time, she wondered if success without connection would taste hollow. The conflict gnawed at her. Daniel carried his own battle. At a board meeting, he listened as his executives discussed projections, but his mind wandered. He thought of Emily's determination, her refusal to accept pity. He thought of how she had seen him not as a billionaire, but as a man. The irony struck him cruelly. For years he had wanted someone to love him without knowing his fortune. And now, when he finally found her, he faced losing her because she had found her own future. That evening, he walked the city streets alone, his hands in his pockets, his thoughts storming. He had always believed control was his greatest strength, yet he could not control this. Love demanded surrender, and surrender terrified him. Emily, meanwhile, sat at her small kitchen table, staring at the scholarship letter again. She knew the rational choice was to accept. It would open doors, give her stability, and allow her to honor her mother's dream. But every time she imagined boarding a plane, she saw Sophie's smile and Daniel's guarded eyes. The cruel truth was that life had offered her both a path and a person, but not together. The tension came to a head a week later when they met by chance at a community event. Daniel had come as part of his company's outreach, though Emily still did not know the full truth of his position. Emily had come as a student volunteer helping with nutrition booths. Their eyes met across the room, both surprised, both hesitant. Sophie ran up to Emily, instantly clinging to her hand. Emily knelt and hugged the little girl tightly, her heart aching. Daniel watched silently, his chest heavy. Later that evening, when the crowd thinned, Daniel approached Emily under the soft glow of the event lights. "You should take the scholarship," he said, before she could speak. She flinched. "You are telling me to leave. I am telling you to live your life." His voice cracked slightly, though he tried to steady it. "You were never meant to be someone's second choice. You were meant to be first in what matters most to you." Emily's eyes blurred with tears. She wanted to argue, to beg him to say, "Stay with me." But pride and fear held her tongue. She turned away, whispering, "I do not know how to choose." Daniel stood rooted to the spot as she walked into the night. The silence he had known before returned heavier than ever. Hope had brought them together, but now the very hope of a future threatened to pull them apart. The weeks that followed unfolded with a heaviness both Daniel and Emily carried in silence. Emily prepared herself for the possibility of leaving, though each step felt like betrayal, not only to Daniel, but to the fragile sense of belonging she had found with Sophie. Daniel buried himself in long hours at the office, hiding behind contracts and numbers, while avoiding the hollow ache that followed him home. Yet fate has a way of orchestrating encounters when hearts are most divided. The community center near Emily's college was hosting a nutrition awareness event, sponsored by a leading company in the city. Emily volunteered to help at the children's booth, arranging healthy snacks and answering questions from curious parents. She was nervous but proud to be part of something that connected to her studies. She wore her scrub top beneath a soft cardigan, her hair tied back neatly. The gymnasium smelled of popcorn and fruit cups, and the chatter of families filled the space. Daniel arrived later that morning wearing a navy blazer, his expression composed, though his mind still troubled. He had agreed to attend because the event was hosted by Blaine Nutrition, a subsidiary of his own company. Few people knew the man behind the name, and he preferred it that way. Tonight, however, the anonymity felt different. It felt like a mask he wished he could remove. He scanned the room distracted until his eyes froze on a familiar figure kneeling beside a child at the reading corner. Emily. She was laughing gently as she helped a little girl choose between picture books. Her eyes shone with warmth, the kind that had been missing from his world for so long. Daniel's breath caught before he even realized he was moving closer. Sophie tugged at his sleeve. "Daddy, look, it is, Emily." Before Daniel could respond, Sophie slipped from his hand and ran straight toward her. Emily turned startled, but her face lit up instantly. She dropped to her knees as Sophie flung her arms around her neck. The embrace was natural, as though they had known each other far longer than a few weeks. Daniel watched, unable to move. Something about the scene pierced through every wall he had built. Emily brushed Sophie's hair back and smiled softly. "Hello, sweetheart. Did you come to read with me?" Sophie nodded eagerly, then whispered something that made Daniel's heart stop. "Sing the song, please." Emily hesitated. "What song, Sophie?" The little girl pressed closer. "The one Mommy used to sing." Daniel froze his throat tight. He had not heard those words spoken aloud in years. Sophie rarely mentioned her mother anymore. Emily's expression softened. She thought for a moment, then hummed a melody almost instinctively, a simple lullaby her own mother had sung to her. The tune floated through the noisy gym, soft but clear. Sophie's eyes widened with recognition, and she nestled against Emily's shoulder. Daniel felt tears burn behind his eyes. The lullaby was nearly identical to the one his late wife had sung to Sophie. For a moment, time folded, and he stood on the edge of grief and healing at once. His vision blurred, but he did not look away. Emily's voice trembled slightly as she sang, yet it carried a purity that wrapped around Sophie like a blanket. Parents nearby turned their heads touched by the quiet moment amid the chaos. Daniel lifted a hand to his mouth, pressing his knuckles against trembling lips. He had not cried in years, not even at the funeral. But now, watching Emily holding his daughter, singing a song that bridged the gap between past and present, he could not stop the tears. Emily noticed him finally, her eyes meeting his across the space. She faltered mid-verse, her own breath catching at the sight of tears streaming down. The face of a man who had seemed unshakable. She whispered the last line, softly finishing the lullaby, before lowering her gaze to Sophie, who had already drifted half asleep against her. Daniel approached slowly, each step heavy with emotion. He crouched beside them, his hand resting gently on Sophie's back. His voice cracked as he whispered, "She has not asked for that song since the night her mother passed." Emily's eyes glistened. She brushed a strand of hair from Sophie's forehead and replied gently, "Children do not forget love. They just wait to hear it again." The words shattered the dam inside Daniel. He lowered his head, closing his eyes as silent tears slipped free. For years he had carried grief alone, believing strength meant silence. In that moment, he realized healing required sharing the weight. Emily reached out hesitantly, resting her hand lightly on his. The touch was simple, yet grounding. Daniel lifted his gaze and saw not pity in her eyes, but understanding. He whispered, "Thank you." She shook her head. "No need," she smiled faintly. "She is a beautiful girl." Daniel's chest ached with a mixture of loss and newfound hope. He had not expected this reunion yet. It felt inevitable, as though every rejection, every twist of fate had led here. For Emily, the moment confirmed what her heart already feared. Leaving would not just mean abandoning Daniel, it would mean walking away from Sophie, who had innocently claimed a place in her heart. She looked down at the little girl's peaceful face and whispered so softly, Daniel almost missed it. "Maybe hope is not foolish after all." Daniel stared at her, his breath catching. The noise of the gym faded, the smell of fruit cups and the chatter of parents all dissolved. There was only Emily holding Sophie, and the realization that the walls he had built could no longer keep her out. The reunion was unplanned, but it was also undeniable. For the first time in years, Daniel felt whole, not because grief was gone, but because someone else had chosen to share it with him. The rooftop garden was filled with the fragrance of rosemary and lavender as evening settled over the city. Rows of white chairs faced a simple podium, while strings of lights swayed gently above. This was not just another corporate event, it was a launch that Daniel had insisted be personal. The new product line focused on nourishment for children, but the theme written across every banner read dignity and second chances. Emily stood at the edge of the crowd holding her invitation in trembling hands. She had not expected to come, but Daniel's text had been brief and without pressure. Thought this might align with your studies, no obligation. Yet the thought of seeing him again after the moment at the community center gnawed at her until she finally gave in. She wore her nursing scrubs beneath a light cardigan, her hair pulled into a bun. She looked more like a student than a guest, but she reminded herself that she belonged here because she cared. The crowd murmured softly as Daniel stepped up to the podium in a tailored suit. He looked composed, yet when his eyes swept the audience, they paused and softened when they found her. Emily felt her breath hitch. His voice carried steady warmth as he spoke about the importance of proper nutrition in early childhood, about the need for products that respected families rather than exploited them. He thanked the researchers, the students, the community workers who had contributed. Every word was genuine, not the rehearsed corporate jargon Emily had expected. Then the unveiling came. Boxes lined the tables in pastel shades, each printed with a silhouette of a woman cradling a child with a spoon in her hand. Emily's throat tightened when she recognized the design. The woman's figure, though subtle, looked achingly familiar. She realized Daniel had used her likeness as inspiration without ever telling her. Her chest swelled with an emotion she could not name. When the applause faded, Daniel stepped down from the podium and made his way directly toward her. He ignored the investors waiting to shake his hand, the photographers hoping for a shot. He walked until he stood before her, the lights above, catching the sincerity in his gaze. "I was not sure you would come," he said. Emily swallowed. "I was not sure I should." Daniel held her eyes. "I am glad you did." For a long moment, silence stretched between them. Then with deliberate care, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He did not kneel or call attention to himself. Instead, he opened it quietly, revealing a simple ring with a single stone. Emily gasped softly, her hand flying to her lips. Daniel's voice lowered, so only she could hear. "I do not want to save you, Emily. I do not want you to choose between your dream and us. I only want to stay if you will let me." Her eyes shimmered. "You are not ordinary," she whispered. "You never were." Daniel shook his head faintly. "That night I was just a man who was left behind. You were just a girl waiting for someone who never came. That is who we truly are, and I think that is enough." Tears slipped free before Emily could stop them. She nodded slowly, not because of the ring, not because of the romance of the setting, but because she finally felt peace. For once, she was choosing love not from desperation, but from truth. Daniel slipped the ring onto her finger with steady hands. No grand applause followed, no orchestrated spectacle. Yet the quiet approval in his eyes was more than she had ever dreamed. Later that evening, they returned to the same restaurant where it had all begun. The hostess recognized Daniel this time, though she said nothing, simply leading them to a familiar corner table. Sophie skipped alongside, holding Emily's hand, her little dress bouncing as she walked. Daniel pulled out a chair for Emily, then helped Sophie into hers. For the first time, there were 3 chairs, not one alone, not 2, facing emptiness, but 3 together. The candlelight flickered, casting soft shadows as menus were handed out. Daniel smiled across the table. "Order everything you want tonight," he said playfully. "Tonight we eat for the girl who waited 45 minutes and still believed someone would show up." Emily let out a watery laugh, her eyes still glistening. "You remember everything." Daniel reached across the table, taking her hand. "I remember you." Sophie beamed and pulled a folded paper from her small backpack. She spread it proudly across the table. It was a crayon drawing of a house with a yellow door and 3 figures at a dinner table. One tall with glasses, one with long blonde hair, and one small with pigtails. "That is us," Sophie said proudly. "And that is spaghetti because Mommy Emily likes spaghetti." Emily pressed a hand to her mouth, overcome. Daniel's throat tightened as he glanced from the drawing to Emily. No words were needed. Everything that mattered was already written in the simple lines of a child's picture. Emily reached out, touching the paper with trembling fingers. "Did you draw this today?" she asked softly. Sophie nodded at preschool. "Teacher said to draw our favorite thing. I drew dinner with you and Daddy." Daniel blinked fast to keep his composure. Emily wiped her eyes quickly and laughed. "It is perfect." Sophie leaned across the table, whispering loudly, "Daddy, do not cry." Daniel chuckled and kissed the top of her head. The evening unfolded gently. They ate together, sharing dishes, laughing at Sophie's stories, listening to the music that drifted softly through the air. Emily felt a warmth she had never known before, not just love, but belonging. For Daniel, it was the quiet miracle of showing up, of being seen at last without needing to prove his worth. As the night drew to a close, Emily lifted her glass, her voice steady, though quiet. "You were never late," she said, meeting Daniel's eyes. "I just needed to believe long enough to wait." Daniel's breath caught. He squeezed her hand tightly and whispered back, "I will never let you wait alone again." Outside, the city lights sparkled against the night sky. Inside, at a small table with 3 chairs, something new had begun. Not a rescue, not a fairy tale, but a family built from rejection, transformed into love. Their story was no longer about being abandoned. It was about finding the right table together,